Good afternoon and welcome to the Women and Equalities Select Committee. Today we're holding an oral evidence session on misogyny, the manosphere and online content. We have two fantastic expert panellists before us. We have James Blake, the award-winning BBC television presenter and documentary filmmaker, and Men of the Manosphere is one of his works, and James Bloodworth, journalist and author, and one of his latest works is Lost Boys, a personal journey through the manosphere. So, do either of you have any questions before we start? Or no? You're happy to kick off? Excellent. So I am going to hand over straight to Kim.
Lovely, thank you, Chair, and thank you both for coming in this afternoon. You've both spent time with people and communities in the manosphere for your work. Could you explain what that experience was like? And I'll start with you, James Blake, if that's okay.
Yeah, sure. So in my documentary, Men of the Manosphere, I spent primarily time with three lads from different age brackets. So one of them was 16, one of them was 22, and one of them was 27, I believe. All very, articulate, intelligent enough guys. And the premise of spending time with them was to understand sort of what is their understanding of what we call the manosphere, how do they fall into that, and how did they get into it initially, I guess. And I think one of the things that stood out to me was the very common theme of self-improvement. And these guys, none of them specifically went into this space wanting to consume misogynistic content, nor did they ever believe they would be sharing it or be saying it. They went into this space for the purposes of self-development. And I truly believe that. As somebody myself who is a big advocate for self-development, I completely understood why they went there. They also were seeking a form of community, like human nature, I guess. We all want to be part of a community. We all want to feel like we matter. We want to be around people who share the same values, etc. And on the face of it, the offering that they could see was, this is great. These are like-minded bunch of guys. They're into fitness. They're into self-improvement. They want to better themselves. And that's kind of how they initially went into it. They never went into it with any kind of malice at thought. So that was one of the biggest things, I guess, that stood out to me. And my experience of spending time with those guys was that as their journey progressed in the manosphere space, the content and the algorithm that was serving them content on social media, because a lot of this now is obviously digital based, the algorithm was continuously feeding them content. And as their journey progressed, I guess that their opinions they were forming weren't really their own. And actually in my documentary, one of the participants says that. He says that, I have these thoughts about a relationship I'm in, but I don't even know if they're my own thoughts. And he was being quite reflective on that and becoming quite self-aware of that. But I do also believe that was because of the conversations I was having with him. And I hate to think that if maybe he didn't have those conversations, would that self-awareness be there? I don't know. But he was forming thoughts that weren't necessarily his. The same with the other contributors in the documentary, including a 16-year-old, kid who has very little life experience, but again, really wants to better himself and become, successful man, whatever that looks like to him. And the manosphere offered that to him. And even, for example, he was developing these misogynistic viewpoints or what could be seen as misogynistic viewpoints. So I just feel that these guys generally were in this for the betterment of themselves, but somewhere along that line that became different, and maybe even unknowingly to them until it was too late. And I guess that was generally my experience of what I seen.
That's really helpful, thank you. And James, for you, is it a similar story? Is it your view that people or young men enter this world with good intent and it is about self-development, or is there anything more sinister going on from the outset?
There wasn't really. I spent kind of almost 5 years investigating the manosphere, having 20 years ago dabbled in the manosphere myself. So back in 2006, I attended a pickup artist boot camp in London for my sins. It was something that this was before the algorithmic internet. This was like internet 1.0. And I discovered this forum of these guru figures who purported to have all the answers when it came to dating. And, it was a mixture of people from those seeking, such as myself, I think, seeking just kind of conversation starters or just some basic advice on how to ask somebody out. But I'd say the thing we had in common was we were willing to overlook the misogyny of the community. So there was the blind spot. I wouldn't say I was any more sexist at the time than mainstream society, but I certainly had blind spots in that area. Otherwise, I would have simply walked away from that material. And I did walk away from that material quite soon. After several months, I kind of realized how silly a lot of this stuff was, how it was driven by profit seeking. They weren't simply figures on the internet who were trying to give advice. They were entrepreneurs. They were masculinity entrepreneurs and businessmen. And this was something that when I revisited the manosphere in 2018 onwards to investigate this subculture as a journalist, again, I met all kinds of people who got drawn into that world. Some of them were people who who were simply looking for kind of advice and pointers when it came to how to meet someone, how to be more social. Socially awkward men who found it very hard to view socializing outside of a problem-solving context. Neurodivergent men with autism. There's that side of it. There were also men, however, who sought out the manosphere to reaffirm misogynistic ideas they held and found these voices, these very charismatic voices a lot of the time, who would then parrot back to them these theories that they may already have been kind of dancing around about women. And also they gave them something external to blame for the fact their life had not turned out as they hoped it might. So these masculinity influencers would tell them that, give them the message that you're not happy because women and minorities are hoarding all of the treasure, essentially, or the sexual revolution is where it's all gone wrong for men. Feminism is where it's all started to go wrong for men. And after a while, I came to see the manosphere really as a sales funnel of somewhere where you have these masculinity entrepreneurs, these businessmen who will diminish men, will diminish their audience, make them feel small, feed them these conspiracy theories that, like the 80-20 rule, this idea that women are only interested in a small percentage of men. And then these masculinity entrepreneurs would then present themselves as saviors and guides who, if you just buy their course, you will be able to escape the surplus men and the incels and whatever fate awaits your male friends, etc. So it was really a sales funnel. I came to see it as it's big business, and women are the primary victims of that, in terms of they're the ones who are on the receiving ends of these misogynistic views when they seep into relationships, when they bleed into a dating context. But there are also male victims as well who are maybe vulnerable and then get drawn into this world and radicalized. And as James said, they may not even know they're being radicalized.
That's really interesting. Thank you so much. So it feels as though what you're saying is there are different routes into the manosphere. So it feels as though there's the self-development, fitness, want to look after myself kind of route. There's the dating and relationships kind of route, and then there's perhaps the people who are unhappy and want someone to reaffirm maybe some of their prejudices or some of their own insecurities. So there's sort of different ways into it, which is really interesting. And James Bloodworth, staying with you go back to 2006. How has the manosphere changed since that time? We're in 2026 now, aren't we, 20 years later?
It's got worse. It's got more political. So there was something, the pickup artists, those kind of individuals were misogynistic, manipulative. That became a big business after Neil Strauss's 2005 book, The Game, came out. It saw the emergence of all these kind of guru figures who sought to profit from male loneliness. But on the one hand, there wasn't an algorithm which then drew people deeper. So back then it was a case of men would log on to these forums and read about these kind of tips on how to meet women, and there would be these guru figures who would emerge who would then try and sell them courses. But there wasn't, you could, once you shut down the the forum, you didn't then pick up your phone and were bombarded. Your timeline wasn't monopolized by all of these men saying, the reason you're not happy is because of feminism and because of the left and because of minorities, LGBT people, etc. So that's changed. And it's also become much more political. So I attended in 2022, October, November 2022, a Red Pill Summit in Orlando, Florida. It was called the 21 Summit. It was like the biggest gathering of followers of the Red Pill. And I expected it to be kind of the usual garden variety misogyny you tended to see in these communities, alongside some kind of boilerplate self-help stuff, about weightlifting and how to hustle and how to be a millionaire, start your own six-figure company, etc. But there was also, I met someone there who'd been involved in January the 6th in the United States, who subsequently went to prison for that. He's now out because Trump pardoned him. And also someone who was advocating, who was trying to recruit for an armed militia to start a civil war against Joe Biden's government, and anti-Semitic conspiracy theories as well. That was something that came up a few times. Basically, the idea was that the Red Pill, they believe that men are oppressed by women and women control the world, but they also believe that women are simultaneously hysterical and stupid. So it's like, how do you square that? If they're, as you say they are, how are they controlling everything? And then sometimes that would involve these darker conspiracies about, women were being controlled by Jews, and feminism was actually a Jewish conspiracy, the sexual revolution, etc. So this stuff had seeped much more into the movement than when I first encountered it in 2006. Because back then, I heard a lot of sexist ideas, but there wasn't really much like overt anti-feminism. It wasn't political. It wasn't like, the reason you can't get a date is because of feminism. It's typically much more based around self-help. You need to improve yourself. That's why you haven't got a partner.
Before you come back on that, could I just ask, so you've talked about and explained how this kind of the manosphere intersects with the alt-right movement. Was there, or is there any kind of, we hear the term brochurist, kind of, was there a left-wing version of this as well, or is it just very much kind of in that alt-right space?
I did encounter people who had been radicalized, who were probably, like when I was in the United States researching, I did meet a few people who'd been Bernie Sanders supporters and then eventually supported Donald Trump. So back in 2016, they'd voted for or supported Bernie Sanders, and then when I met them again, when I went back after COVID, they were now kind of very much open Donald Trump supporters. But I don't know if that's, I think they've been radicalized. I don't think, cause isn't correlation, isn't causation, etc. I don't think it's the two things are necessarily linked. Maybe they just were never willing to vote or support a woman, but they'd been radicalized in the process, I think, and they were much more red-pilled, so to speak. Whereas initially they tended to be more into the pickup stuff, and I want to get a girlfriend, and I'm going to listen to these guys because I think they're going to help me.
Thank you. Sorry, go for it.
Thank you. And can I just ask a couple of extra points on that then? So at that event and other things like that, is there any you talked about anti-Semitism, is there any intersection with religion in terms of the sort of taking over of religious beliefs from that environment? Does that make sense? So in terms of Christianity, we're seeing sort of worrying things, I think, happening in this country and in other countries around that. And then the other point is, you mentioned the word loneliness, and do you think we need a bit more leadership in terms of community building and providing opportunities for connection, addressing loneliness, so that people are not pushed towards some of these behaviours and thoughts?
So Christian nationalism was something that I observed when I started to visit the States again after COVID, beginning in 2022. There was much, the Red Pill conference I attended was much more inflected with these Christian nationalist beliefs. There's an example of an influencer on YouTube called Elliot Hulse, who was a strength influencer, self-improvement influencer, who then was advocating this kind of Christian nationalism when I met him in person in 2022. And it seemed to be that, so on the one hand you had these misogynistic influencers who draw on evolutionary psychology, or a very, if I can use the phrase, bastardized version of evolutionary psychology. to justify their beliefs. So they try and give it this scientific penumbra and say that, you know, men and women are different because science says so Darwinism says so, etc. And there were also these other men who would draw on religion to try and make those justifications, as this kind of giving these kind of theological justifications for why women should be subordinate to men, why women shouldn't vote, why women shouldn't be in the workplace, etc. And that definitely had crept into it more in later years when I visited the manosphere.
Just on Logan's,
Yeah.
I've kind of superseded something David's going to ask you shortly, so we'll come back to that if you can, but we would like to know more about that. And James, just to finish my section, I'll come to you if I can. You discussed in your documentary sharing content by Andrew Tate on your social media account. What prompted you to do that, and what did you learn from that experience?
Sure, no problem. Can I just add something to the last question?
Sure.
Because you were asking about the lack of like communities outside of the manosphere and things like that. Just to make it more real for everybody in this room, I went to Portugal with young Sam from my documentary, who's 16 years old. He flew to Portugal to spend a week with other 16, 17, 18-year-olds in a little flat to basically work together and, you know, improve each other and keep each other motivated and things like that. And I sat with those guys and I asked them, what do you do outside of the internet to build community? Like, do you go to youth clubs? And every single one of these guys, and there was like 6 or 7 of these guys, did not know what a youth club was, which to me, they were literally like, what is a youth club? You know, so you're thinking about real life scenarios outside of the internet, they don't even know where to go. And that was just one of the things that I think was keeping them online in those communities as well. But yeah, I just wanted to add that because that really took me back whenever I heard that.
And I think the other thing that strikes me with that as well is presumably they weren't into sport, because if we think about young male identity, that's often where young men find their home and find their people and find their identity. But are we talking about people who are generally not members of a football team or a rugby club or?
Yeah, I mean, they weren't really members of football clubs or anything like that. They were interested in sports, but they didn't seem to participate in team sports or anything like that. But I guess that speaks to the whole sort of hedonistic approach of like wanting to better yourself. It's all about yourself. They weren't really into team sports or anything like that. But when I explained to them what youth clubs were, they were like, wow, that sounds cool. Like, I would love that, you know? And that really just took me back because I spent a lot of my childhood going to youth clubs and it kept me out of trouble. It kept me from doing a lot of silly things. And I think that that just really surprised me.
Sorry, and then my question was about sharing the content from Andrew Tate and what that was like.
So I guess to sort of explain my situation when I shared that content, to take it right back, I come from a working class background. I grew up in a council house. My father was a taxi driver. My mum was a retired politician who started doing charity stuff. And I guess for me, one of my biggest drivers and motivations was to be, I guess what you could say is sort of like financially free. And I used to see all of this stuff, even in a different format. You know, I'm 32 now, but when I was 16, I would have been reading books, self-development books. I read some of the books that actually James just mentioned there as well. And I was massively into self-development and improving myself because I seen that as a working class guy as a way out. I grew up in a house with no stability. I had an older learning disabled brother who I helped care for, and that brought with it a lot of friction and, you know, different things that I had to deal with as a young lad. So for me, I always wanted to be successful because that was kind of my way out of that in my mind. And luckily I worked really hard and I did well. And I got to the point where I could buy a Lamborghini and I could do all this cool stuff that, you know, I always dreamed about doing when I was a kid. And with that came, I guess, a lot of attention on social media. I started to build up my own following. And I personally have a lot of young lads that message me and they're asking for advice from me. They're wanting to know what direction they should go in. They maybe grew up in a similar background to me and they feel lost. They're maybe not educated to a high level and they're thinking, how can I achieve this and that? So I was sort of in this little world at that time where I'm doing well, I'm doing all this cool stuff, I'm living out my dream, I've got all of these kids coming to me, and then Andrew Tate popped up. And for me, Andrew Tate, when I initially seen him, the things that he was saying, I completely resonated with. And I'll just be honest, I did. You know, it was things like, if you come from, you know, poverty or from a less advantageous background, you need to just work harder than everybody else. And I was like, hell yeah, because I've had to do that, like, of course. Things like go to the gym, look after yourself, drive the cool cars, do all the cool stuff. That sounded great to me. So I, of course, started to think, wow, this guy's, super cool. Started to follow him. But I guess as time went on, the algorithm starts to show you more and more and more of that content. So I've been in the position that the young lads in my documentary are also in. And I seen this content coming at me. Did I agree with all of it? No. But at one point in time, I had a 6-year relationship breakdown. I became single. This girl, I thought I was going to marry her. She was, a big deal to me. So I was very, very upset. And as most men are, when you're upset, you tend to kind of go in on yourself. And we typically don't have the same support mechanisms as women do. A lot of my friends, maybe that's a generalization, but I do feel like for me personally, I didn't have, a friendship group that checked in on me. I didn't have anybody ringing me to say, oh, you okay, mate? Nothing like that. So I spent a lot of time on my phone, just looking at content and things like that. And I guess that moment of lowness made me seek security and confirmation of my own bias from people outside of me, and I didn't have anyone around me. So it was social media, it was Andrew Tate, it was individuals popping up. And yeah, I think I shared some things. Whenever I looked back at it, I thought, oh my God, I can't even remember sharing that to begin with, but also, wow, I would never share that now. But it just goes to show that your mind can go to that place, even if it's in a small way. And I remember sitting with the director when we filmed that scene, and he kind of threw it on me as a surprise. I wasn't expecting it. We were sitting in my living room and he said, right, we've got some old videos you shared on social media. And I was kind of like, right, okay. And he showed me them, and I thought, oh my God, I honestly can't remember even sharing that. But I watched it back, and interestingly, some of the clips that he showed me, and I think this is in the documentary, I didn't actually even notice the misogyny in it. So when I was watching it, I was like, I'm not really too sure what's wrong with that clip. And then he was like, let's watch it again. And I watched it again, and I looked at it through a different lens, and then I could see it. And I was sort of like, you know what, I'm watching that back now, having went through a whole process of maturing, growing up, this is years later, and having a completely different mind frame. And still, when I first watched that, I didn't see the misogyny in that. But the second time around, when questioned about it, I could see it. And that was quite a startling thing to me, because I did not foresee that happening, but also it made me think about, I wonder how much stuff I was consuming at that time without realising it. And I think that reflects the experience of a lot of young lads. And again, as I say, this seems to impact, from what I can see through my experience and through the experience of the guys I spent time with, it impacts the most when you're at a low point, not when you're at a high point. And it seems to be that the nature of self-development is most people seek it when they're at a low point. Nobody's already making millions and going, I need to get better. It's the people that are coming from backgrounds like mine, who come from working class backgrounds, who possibly might have a follower or maybe don't have a follower or a mother, and they don't have the motivation from that individual to say, oh, I want to be just like my dad, or I want to be like my mum. So they look at external places. Sometimes it's movie stars, sometimes it's fictional characters, and then suddenly there's somebody like Andrew Tate, who for the most part is a fictional character, but appears very real to a lot of these young lads. And if I myself, at the age of, I think I was mid-20s, my father had just passed away, my 6-year relationship had ended, I was at a very low point, and I found some sort of solace in what these people were saying. Now, thankfully, I pulled myself back from it very fast, but not everybody is that aware to do that, and that is very worrying.
That's really, really interesting. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Kim. Christine's got a supplementary, and then I have one as well.
Yeah, something you said actually resonated with me, because in a media interview recently, I was asked about one political party's plans to do away with the Equality Act because it does down working class boys and men. And we're seeing that increasingly in the political arena. And what you said about it originally saying if you're working class, you have to work harder. Well, I wouldn't disagree with that. Do you see, if you like, a route between or a connection between what you were seeing in the manosphere then and what we are beginning to see being used to attract people in the political sphere now?
Maybe this is one more for you because you've seen the political side of it more so than I have.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of, so one kind of thing I noticed in the manosphere was these entrepreneurs would make their money by one way they would make their money would be by discrediting the mainstream. So discrediting mainstream institutions, mainstream dating advice, their family, their friends. There was very much this cult-like mentality to it. So if your friends and your family tell you different to what we're telling you, that's because they don't want you to succeed, because they're comfortable with you as you are, and they would discredit these things to then present their own product. So you see this in the wellness industry, for example, where you have these entrepreneurs who will discredit mainstream medicine, will discredit vaccinations, will discredit antidepressants, whatever it is. And there's no clear distinction online between intellectuals and entrepreneurs. So they're advertising products. They're presenting themselves as people who are knowledgeable and have advice on these topics, but really they're trying to discredit the mainstream to then sell their own alternative product. And I think you do see that with a certain type of populist political entrepreneur now who will present themselves as having all of the answers and the secret sauce, if you like, and they will discredit the mainstream and discredit the mainstream media, try to discredit the mainstream media. And it's not simply because they're, because they really have the answers. It's because they seek to capitalize on, by presenting an alternative and seek to profit from that. That I thought that was quite similar to the techniques used in the manosphere. Discredit the mainstream, then present yourself as the savior and guide and the alternative. And especially among people who, on the one hand, there's people who are already vulnerable, who may be themselves looking for someone to kind of give, they're looking for someone to believe and someone to follow, someone to believe in, someone to blame and someone to follow very often. But also I think sometimes it's not just people who are already vulnerable. So I mean, these ecosystems, in terms of the manosphere, they can create the vulnerability. So someone can find the manosphere content as a confident, well-rounded person, just like someone can find some other forms of advertising and maybe fine, but the advertising convinces themselves that they're not enough as they are. And that's something that women have had to deal with for a long time in terms of the cosmetic industry, the beauty industry. Makes them feel like they're not enough and then presents this product that they need. Well, the manosphere is the same in many ways, and you could say that some types of populism, those politicians operate on a similar wavelength, and social media has really allowed them to amplify their message, because in the past these individuals would be in the back pages maybe of a men's magazine or something with their little advertisements selling their get-rich-quick schemes or their magic beans or whatever, and you wouldn't encounter it. But nowadays they are on this 6-inch screen that we're all glued to all the time. They're often incredibly charismatic individuals, and they're presenting this stuff against a backdrop of this lifestyle that can be very appealing to, say, a teenage boy, of these fast cars, these mansions, this luxurious travel, private jets, and the most important status symbol in that world is the women. And yeah, there are parallels with politics. Sorry, that was a bit long-winded, but I hope you can kind of see some of the parallels. It's like masculinity entrepreneurs and political entrepreneurs.
Thank you very much. Kevin.
Thank you, Chair. And thank you both. That's really good stuff so far. It's helped me to understand a lot more about what's going on and what's pulling people into the manosphere. I like to explore. It's a real feeling it's becoming more and more popular. It's a little bit amorphous to people that maybe not engaged with it. So Mr. Blake, actually, can you just talk to me a bit more about when you were filming your documentary? What were the common characteristics that you found between with the men and boys that you were speaking to?
Yeah. So honestly, without talking out of turn, I think there's a common sense of desperation amongst all of the contributors, and I felt that myself in my own life. And that desperation is towards confusion around wanting to be successful, but maybe not coming from a privileged enough background to have access to certain things that you see other people may have access to. There's an element there of extreme ambition, but potentially lacking the education or skill set to, utilise that properly. And also, there's kind of an element of the world is against us. And I think that's created and nurtured throughout the manosphere. That sense of the world is against us keeps people in. It becomes an echo chamber, and it becomes a sort of like subculture nearly of, it's us against them. And that is a really effective way to control people, when you have people in this little group. So all of the guys were sort of similar in that sense. But what I would also say is they were all intelligent. They were all, on the face of it, very friendly, nice guys. There was no, if you would meet them and say, I'd have a drink with that guy, or, maybe not in the 16-year-old's case, but, you would say, like, they're nice guys, nice kid. And, like little Sam, for example, at 16, extremely articulate, very intelligent. I just wanted to be a big brother to him and say, look, you have so much potential, but obviously it's not my place to do so. But Sam, has all of the makings of someone who could be very successful, but I just feared that the consumption of the content that he was consuming up to a certain point was quite dangerous, because that brought in the red pill stuff, that brought in the sort of the misogynistic side of things, which at that age you should not be, exposed to. I mean, I certainly wasn't at that age, and it's crazy to think they are. But they all have access to this stuff. They all want to better themselves. They all want to have that idealistic life, which is fast cars, lots of money, beautiful women by their side. That's how they rate success, and also how they measure being a man, which I think is important to touch on, which is their viewpoint of what a man is maybe necessarily skewed and quite different than, for example, Sam was consuming content by a creator who was saying if your father works a 9-to-5 job, he's a loser, essentially, which obviously is crazy. And he had some sort of nickname for them and all of this kind of thing. But, like that is just insane to think that, somebody who is going out to work, providing for their family, and I guess you could say being a man, is being seen as less than because he has a structured life, So those kind of things I think were quite worrying, and they all shared that kind of viewpoint because they were all seeing this content that was creating that.
You want to come in? Sorry.
I'd just add, I suppose, that one thing I kind of quickly noticed with the manosphere, I mean, there was everything was kind of seen through the prism of like the market. So they talked about like the sexual marketplace. They talked about the dating economy, and they talked about their own sexual market value. So they embark on these self-improvement programs to improve their sexual market value. And so on the one hand, you had this old-fashioned misogyny and this old-fashioned patriarchal viewpoints. But then you also had, women were just another commodity. Women became another status object in that world. So you had the fast car. As James said, you had the kind of social media created this sense of not being enough. So social media created this sense of pauperization that everyone else was having more sex than them. Everyone else was having this much more enjoyable lifestyle than them, and being an ordinary man in a 9-to-5 job wasn't enough. And then from there, it wasn't that hard to see how women were treated as just objects in that world rather than full human beings. They were just status objects in that world. And it wasn't so difficult then to see always how some of the misogyny flowed from that.
Kevin, can I just come in on that point? Because there is a missing part of this, which is we don't know how or why it is that they were able to get these women. Was there any viewpoint given about why women were going to go out with people like Andrew Tate? I mean, there are obviously legal issues on that front, but how was it that they were able to capture beautiful women and commodify this as something that people want? Like, were women active participants in this kind of beefing up the manosphere and that kind of performance of masculinity for online content, or was there something darker going on, did you see?
I mean, the content, I mean, one difference between the early manosphere that I encountered and later was the earlier manosphere in 2006. It was comprehensible in terms of these men, they want to turn themselves into the objects of female desire. They want to make themselves very attracted to women. And the manosphere, when I went back to it, these men were performing for other men. It was for the male gaze. It was their idea of what success is, but it was a male idea of success. And the way, social media, the way they performed for social media, they would sometimes hire models for their social media content. I mean, I went out to the desert in Nevada with one of these groups, and they'd hired a Lamborghini, and they'd do photo shoots in front of it to make it look like this was the lifestyle they were living. There were others who were hiring out cabins which were kitted out like a private jet inside and then sitting, with a laptop and then putting captions "office for the day" when they uploaded it to Instagram. And it was tragic, but then they'd also then film themselves at a nightclub where they had bottle service tables because they knew the host for the nightclub, so they'd got a free table, but they're making out, when Calvin Harris is playing, they've got a DJ set. And then some women will join that because they've invited them to join and it's free alcohol and stuff, and then they'll film it and make out that that's their, because social media doesn't show the whole picture. And so some kid watching that is thinking this is what they're doing 24/7. They don't know that the women have been hired. They don't know that this is just a scam. It's not really their lifestyle.
Yeah, can I just add to that? It is complete perception, and even I experienced some of the online courses that are sort of out there at the minute that these young lads are consuming, and to be honest, there is very little involvement in those from women whatsoever. And interestingly, a lot of it is performative for other men. Even for example, in the community groups that these guys are in, they're putting in topless photographs of themselves and asking other men to rate them. They're putting in, stories about, for example, one of the stories that I seen was a guy had started a job. He was working in somewhere. He was quite attracted to a co-worker, and someone basically wrote on it like, if you want to date her, you're gay, which of course makes no sense. But that's the kind of language that's used. That's the kind of structure of it. It's very childlike. It's very it's just very as James had said. It's all about male gaze. There's very little involvement from women whatsoever, aside from the perception that by doing this stuff you will attract more women. But it's like yet to be proven. It's just here's
the irony of it is the deeper the manosphere you go, the more time you spend with other men rather than women.
Yeah.
Thank you, David. You, just before I come back to you, Kevin, was your supplementary about this specific point?
It actually links very well with what you've just spoken about. I think Kevin was in the same room as me when we met a young gay man who had been pulled into the manosphere when he was younger, and he was gay at the time. He knew he was gay at the time, yet he was pulled into the manosphere at that point. And as two gay men ourselves, we found that quite surprising. It was something we never expected, and I'm wondering whether that's something you often see, and if you do, what's the reason why gay men get pulled into this?
I mean, I have to be honest, from my experience and the guys that I spent time with and the elements of their lives that they showed me, I seen very little involvement from the LGBT community at all, if any, to be honest. I don't know if you...
No, it was the same. It was the same for me. I mean, gay men, for example, were seen as... they didn't have a problem with lesbians. Funnily enough. But gay men were seen as they were failing at masculinity because to perform masculinity successfully, it was to have this, either not even just a girlfriend, but like a harem of women competing over you or something. That was one of the tenets of a successful performance of masculinity. So I mean, I didn't encounter gay men in the manosphere, although saying that I didn't encounter openly gay men in the manosphere. So there was one guy at the Red Pill conference who'd been thrown out of the military in America decades ago for being gay, but now he was presenting himself as a Christian nationalist, and said he'd kind of got over all of that, and it was behind him. So there were examples of that. I did see sometimes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kevin.
Yeah, I've often raised a bit of a wry gay smile at a lot of this, because some of it's actually very familiar, kind of following on from what David was saying, really. There's always been a bit of a trend of guys who are not comfortable with their sexuality overcompensating publicly, and I think that was kind of what we picked up in that interaction. And also from the stuff you've been saying, it's very much these grifters are producing this material and they're promoting sort of grifter mindset, a philosophy on it, which isn't really masculinity, it's actually something slightly different. But on that, you've also both talked a lot about social media, and that's a strong driver of this and driving people towards the manosphere. But actually, I think Mr. Bloodworth, how is it doing it? What are the mechanisms that these social media companies, from your investigations, are actually using?
I mean, the social media companies, the way they facilitate these kind of smaller scale entrepreneurs to put out, obviously for a long time, the pickup artist content was given a free rein on YouTube. So it was only around 2017, I think, that YouTube really started to probably crack down on kind of men filming themselves approaching women, say on Oxford Street or something. And there was a BBC investigation in 2019 again, which saw much more of that content then taken off the internet. It's more really, I suppose, how on social media there isn't really that clear separation or signposting between what's advertising and what's not. So if I was to watch, say, if I was to put on the TV, BBC or something, or ITV, and someone's advertising a product to me, someone's selling a product to me, or reading a newspaper and seeing an advert or a magazine, it tends to be this separation. It's clearly signposted that this is advertising. Whereas with a lot of these masculinity entrepreneurs, they start off giving the impression that they're just giving advice. So a boy I interviewed, he was, I think, 13 at the time of his discovering the manosphere. And touching on the previous point, he'd had a very domineering stepfather who'd made him feel small and that he wasn't enough, and he wasn't confident in his masculinity. And so he wanted to do kickboxing. He thought, if I do a combat sport, that may make me more masculine. And he discovered Andrew Tate, and he said this guy was very charismatic. He seemed very knowledgeable about, I mean, maybe kickboxing is the one topic that Andrew Tate is actually somewhat knowledgeable about, because he was quite good at that. And he started watching these videos, and very soon it started to segue into advice on dating and life, and then he came in with these products he was selling, these courses he was selling, how to be more of a man, how to be a millionaire, how to attract women, and that there was at no point was there any kind of like he was kind of falling down the sales funnel without really realizing it. I think that's a big part of the problem. And these entrepreneurs now, they can present this outrageous life, this ostentatious lifestyle as the backdrop. They're very charismatic. They have this very telegenic charisma. And I think the kind of regulatory world, if you like, hasn't really caught up with that. I mean, there's talk of banning social media for children. I don't know whether that's the answer or not. But what is happening at the moment is these people are advertising these courses which rely on them making people feel insignificant, insecure, and small, and they're circumventing socialization from parents, teachers, good role models, and they're kind of beaming it straight to a kid's bedroom on the phone. And that's why you have these men who feel like to have a normal life, as you said, isn't any longer enough. You have to have this superstar lifestyle, otherwise you're a loser, basically. And I think that social media allows these entrepreneurs to circumvent these more positive forms of socialization and really like dial in on the insecurities of the individual.
And this sort of demonetisation, deplatforming that you talked about, that clearly had some impacts. I mean, is that stuff that long term we could do more of? Is that really the route to tackling a lot of this?
I think it did work to an extent, because when people say, oh, this stuff doesn't really work, and I mean, the biggest pickup artist company in the world for most of the 2000s and the 2010s, a company called Real Social Dynamics, they pivoted to just boilerplate self-help advice after the YouTube demonetization, because they couldn't make money from their videos on YouTube anymore, which they made a huge amount from in the past. So a lot of these other figures emerged instead, and they started to put out content on other channels like Rumble, channels which aren't, which they see as like bastions of free speech, and there's no censorship and whatnot. But it's definitely had an impact to some degree, and some of the influencers who emerged in the 2010s, who were then kicked off platforms like Twitter. So Milo Yiannopoulos is someone who comes to mind as an alt-right influencer. They really lost a lot of their foothold on their segment of the public, if you like, on mass appeal when they were demonetized. So I wouldn't say it's the full answer, especially now when social media platforms can just be taken over by figures like Elon Musk, who can turn it into a free-for-all again. But it definitely does have an impact on people's revenue streams when it's done in a smart way, I would say.
That's really useful to hear. And I think, and you talked about the social media ban, and actually, Mr. Blake, when you were meeting particularly younger users, or I don't know what we call them really, people in the manosphere, what's your take on social media ban at 16? Do you think that's could be an effective tool or not?
Yeah, I do believe it could be effective, but I don't think it's going to solve the problem completely. You know, I think, just touching on one of the things that James was saying there about the demonetization, etc., and all of that, that's all well and good, but a lot of the monetization happens off platform. So it's all well and good that the creators don't get paid for their content, but actually a lot of their revenue comes from off-site stuff. So it comes from their websites, it comes from things like that. You know, Andrew Tate is an example who his website got taken down whenever it was at the height of his kind of thing. And now it's back up, you know, and there is, I don't know the exact figure off the top of my head, but he's making millions of pounds off of subscriptions on that website. And alongside that, you know, the social media power cycle now is so much greater. So I don't know if anybody in here is aware of social media clippers. Might be a reference you know or might not, but social media clippers essentially will go to platforms such as Rumble, Kick, the platforms that James had mentioned there, and they will actually cut content from those channels. And these social media clippers themselves, they don't work directly for these influencers. They're just doing this off their own bat. But some of them are using monetization on platforms like TikTok to make a substantial amount of money. In fact, one of them actually approached an influencer on a live stream and told him that he made his first £1 million clipping his content. And the pieces of content that often get clipped are, of course, the most polarizing pieces of content. They are the most misogynistic pieces of content because they get shared more, they get more engagement, they drive more views, and therefore more revenue for the clipper. So that's a whole other side to this social media thing that is really expansive, and it's growing fast. It's growing very fast.
And are they automated? Are they sort of robots crawling?
So they're literally kids in their bedrooms, right. You know. But with the obviously with technology evolving now with AI, they can make, you know, hundreds of clips in a very short period of time, whereas a couple of years ago you would have had to have manually sat, recorded and clipped it. AI now is moving at such a great pace. There's softwares that can just clip content like that. But that is making a huge flood of content, flood the social media channels. And if you put yourself in the position of a young man on social media, I did a test on social platforms within my documentary where I basically got a brand new mobile phone. I downloaded the social media apps and I browsed through the phone. Now, I didn't engage with anything, I simply browsed. But the videos that I would stop at, so for example, I had to think like, you know, a young lad, so I was stopping at videos of cars, I was stopping at videos of the gym, very innocent, mundane, normal stuff. But as I did this, by day 3, I was starting to get served misogynistic content, and by day 5 I was seeing memes and videos of, for example, there was a video of Conor McGregor training an MMA fighter, and he was punching somebody in the stomach, and the caption was, "When you find out she's pregnant," or something like that. So, and you have to keep in mind that that account had not engaged with any content, yet because I was registered as a male and I had browsed through cars and things like that, that found its way to me within 5 days. So you're being bombarded with really, explosive content.
And just quickly, what's the economic engine for this? Where's the money flowing through to these clippers?
Well, I mean, to be honest, those creators, I'm unsure if they're monetizing or not. Some of them may be, some of them may not be. But, it's in the platform's interest to have as much content, getting as much engagement as possible at all times. It means they make more money on their bottom line from advertisers. So there's always money getting made somewhere, whether it's the creator themselves or the platform themselves.
Just one last thing from me, really, because we talked about the ban for under 16s.
Yeah.
Is this an under 16s problem, or even the men in their 20s problem? I mean, I know I didn't really feel like it wasn't when I was 18 that everyone said that you're an adult that I felt like I was a man. It was in my late 20s. What age groups are we really talking about here? Because that really impacts on whether an under 16 ban is going to affect this.
To be honest, I again, in my documentary, I spent time with a 16-year-old, but on the flip side, I spent time with a 27-year-old, and they were consuming the same content. I'm 32. I see the content myself. I don't think the under 16 ban is just going to completely eradicate this problem whatsoever. I think it may be a plaster of some sort, but I don't think it's the solution.
Yeah, I mean, there were mixed stages. I mean, most people who I met who'd signed up to these like alpha male courses and this kind of stuff, they were 20s, 30s, 40s, and then there was 1 or 2, sometimes 50s. And I don't know whether a ban is the right approach, but I think the danger with the ban though is that you can be banned from social media until you're 16 or whatever, and then you go on, and it seems like this free for all, and you have no idea how to navigate it. And also, I would say that some of the people who seem to be the most confused by some of the AI stuff now are members of my family who are like baby boomer generation, who interacting with someone on, well, not my family, but I've seen people interacting with, they think it's Brad Pitt and then they send money and it's an AI. I mean, that's all conspiracy theories. That's a huge problem. So I think media literacy is important as long as we define what that is. And also creating these aisles of sanity, if you like, where schools, for example, where kids aren't on their phones in school, so you can have a counter narrative, so we can kind of, around like more progressive ideas around equality, so people aren't then, so it isn't just entirely circumvented by these charismatic snake oil salesmen online.
Thanks, Kevin. I want to just explore this generational issue in the manosphere. Refuge have just come out with some research that looks at Gen Z's take on marriage. And 1 in 3 Gen Zers believe that a wife should obey their husband. That is twice as many as the boomer generation. Do you see the manosphere having played a huge role within that kind of shift in thought? James Blake, probably I'm going to ask you first. I think Mr. Bloodworth,
sure.
We're probably of the same generation. We're geriatric millennials, sorry.
Yeah. Or you were going to say Gen X.
No.
So I mean, I guess the most information I got around that side of things was when I was in Portugal with the group of young lads that had all travelled out to be there. So these were guys from all around the world. I think there was somebody from Estonia, somebody from America, and then from the UK as well. And I sat with them all and we talked about that. I asked them about their opinions on women and relationships and marriage. And interestingly, every guy in that room wanted to have this idealistic life where they have the wife, they have the kids, and actually deep down that's kind of all that they wanted. But they also were then saying things like, I believe that it's in a woman's nature to be submissive to a man. And things around that tonality, similar things to that, and saying that as a man it's your responsibility to be a provider, and you're supposed to be dominant over the woman, and that's just how it is. But again, it's like they're not. I don't really think they think that. I think that they're just repeating things that they've heard, and I'm not sure if that's actually what they genuinely think, because when we dived a bit deeper, for example, one of the guys was only there because he had his heart broken in a breakup, and suddenly he was there and he was listening to these guys saying, women are this, women are that, women should be like this, and he's kind of thinking, maybe you're right, but again, like I said earlier, it's those moments of low that this stuff infiltrates and becomes, I guess it infiltrates your mind and becomes your thought process. But generally, they were saying things that, adhere to that. But do I think that they truly believe it? I don't think so. However, that could just be the group that I was with, because as I said, they were quite nice people. I think they were just quite confused and they were lost and they were trying to find their way, especially the younger guys. But it obviously doesn't excuse coming out with things like that. Somebody should be checking that, but it doesn't seem like there is. And because they are in this echo chamber where everything is just repeated back to them, there's no one to challenge that, So if you say a woman belongs in the kitchen, nobody's going to say different, because they stay within that community. The online community could have hundreds to thousands of people within it, and they all echo that exact sentiment back to you. So at no point is anybody challenging that, and I think that in itself is a big problem. That's a problem for anything, but obviously more so for something that's dangerous like this.
And in terms of kind of thinking about different characteristics as well, so we've kind of explored age and generational issues, but was there any kind of ethnicity crossover, cultural issues at all? Nothing?
Honestly, the guys were all so varied. They were all from different backgrounds, different cultures. The only thing that really brought them together was that desperation for success, the desperation to be a man. That was the thing that brought them all together, and I don't think any of them really knew what that looked like, but they were basing it on what they've seen on social media and through these courses.
Thank you.
Yeah, definitely someone else's idea of what being a man is, and I think that touches on the previous point as well about creating those aisles of sanity, those kind of counter narratives. And I think we could talk about why Gen Z. So the program, the film Adolescence, the series Adolescence, it ends it begins really with this apocalyptic murder, and I don't want to give too many spoilers in case anyone's still not seen it, but
Hackthorn can give evidence as part of this inquiry.
Okay.
Yes, we've
Okay.
all seen.
No spoilers.
There are no spoilers.
So there's this apocalyptic murder in the series, and then after there was, some might say there was kind of a sudden public conversation, almost a moral panic about are our children going to be committing a murder because they've watched an Andrew Tate video or something. Whereas I'd say the influence of the manosphere is much more subtle but still insidious. So it's about how it creeps into the domestic setting, how it creeps into relationships, how it creeps into friendship groups. So there was a 2025 Ipsos poll which found that I think it was 53% of Gen Z men essentially believe that women are only interested in high status men. They believe the 80-20 rule was a real thing, the 80-20 conspiracy theory. There was another poll from I think the year before which found that a very slim majority of Gen Z men thought that feminism had gone too far, and now men were the ones who were oppressed rather than women. And these are classic manosphere narratives, and you can also find other statistics on how likely a man is to be falsely accused of rape, for example. Whereas actually, the fact is, a man's more likely to be raped by another man in Britain than be falsely accused of rape. It's vanishingly rare, but you have this prevalent belief that in certain sections of society that it's actually quite common. And this to me is an example of ideas from the manosphere, conspiracy theories essentially, becoming more mainstream, and then potentially creeping into the domestic setting, into people's personal relationships. And that's partly down to the algorithm, but it's also partly down to the kind of material circumstances Gen Z face in many ways, and not just Gen Z. So there's a housing crisis, and you have many people now living with their parents into their well into their 20s, their 30s, even their 40s. And, then it is harder to form a relationship. It's harder to form a sexual relationship. And these influencers will tell them that it's because of feminism when it's really because we have a housing crisis. And there's also, if you're at the bottom end of the labour market, there isn't necessarily as much status attached to a working class job as there may have been in the past. So, I have relatives who did working class jobs, and there was a great pride in the work they did. There was a certain element of status attached to that. They were very proud of that, and that isn't really the case necessarily if you work in an Amazon warehouse or something. So then they're more susceptible to these messages they see online that James talked about, where it feels like you're not enough and you have to kind of become rich or present this ostentatious lifestyle.
Thank you. I guess planning reform isn't really what social media loves to see, is it? So, Christine, I'm going to hand over to you to talk about the monetisation.
Yeah, thank you very much. You've talked about how influencers are actually entrepreneurs, but how are they selling? How are they making their money? What is it that physically that they're selling that they get money from? How do they do that?
Courses, mentoring, mentorship programs. So if they present the lifestyle, they create this internet persona, and then we'll say, buy my course and you can be a real man, you can be an alpha male, a high status male like me. So the course I spent time embedded in Nevada in America was called the Men of Action course, and one of the things the guru figure, the instructor, said was that, and he recruited from social media through this larger than life internet profile where he's always surrounded by these women, these glamorous looking women. He said, you need to, you're not going to be one of the surplus men because you've joined my course. He was like, this is Noah's Ark, and I'm saving you from being one of the surplus men and being part of the kind of 80%. And he also said, interestingly, that to the men during one induction session, he said, for many of you, this will be the first true locker room experience you've ever had. So it was about spending time with other men. They never felt they had that kind of those public spaces. Maybe they could spend time with other men in growing up, the youth club, or maybe never had a father figure. Like I didn't have a father, present father, or a grandfather growing up, and they went in search of that because they felt like there was something missing.
Mr. Blake said that he thinks some of the young men who were on the manosphere were repeating things, but they didn't genuinely believe it. Does that apply to the entrepreneurs as well? Do they genuinely believe what they're saying, or is it just a way to make money?
I think eventually it's sort of the distinction it's a distinction without a difference eventually. Like they may, even if they didn't start off believing it, even if it was just a financial, if it was a way to make money, the mask comes to fit the face, as it were. So they may be playing a character, but then they become the character essentially, and it sort of doesn't really matter if they're espousing certain views to build an audience, whether it's audience capture. There's that kind of symbiotic relationship between the audience wants more extreme content, and so they lean into that. It sort of doesn't matter because the ecosystem trends more extreme. That's sort of what matters, I'd say.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, I think leaning into the more polarizing content will always work better. It's always going to get you more engagement. It's always going to get you more followers, more clicks, and eventually more revenue. So the more polarizing, the better, unfortunately, in a lot of those situations. And I think that that polarizing figure that they create might not necessarily be who they are, but it makes them money, and that's how they continue. And the problem with that is that you have the young lads watching that and thinking that's who they really are and that's who they need to become, not knowing that it's actually a complete creation of the beast itself, which is the algorithm, and it's just a vicious cycle.
Thank you.
Thanks, Christine. I'm going to go to Alex now, and then I'm going to hand over to David.
Thank you. This is fascinating and depressing in equal measure. But I'm so glad that you're both here to answer our questions, so thank you. I'd like to talk a little bit, or ask you a little bit about the online-offline link and how this the manosphere then translates into real life and real relationships, which you touched on a little bit. So I really don't mind who goes first on this, but based on your conversations with men and boys in the manosphere, briefly, how would you describe their attitudes towards women?
I'm happy to go ahead. So I think their attitudes are, as I said earlier, I don't think their attitudes are completely their own opinions. They're not based off their own opinions. They're based off of things that they've heard or what they've consumed. And I can give a real life example of that where, I met a guy during the filming who was one of the contributors. When we started filming, he had just met a girl. And he really liked her, ticked all the boxes, she liked all the same things as him. And we were having a conversation about that in a boxing gym. So he was training, we were talking, and really nice guy, conversation was going well. And I sort of said to him, look, so you're in a relationship, what do you think about that? And he sort of said, well, I really like her and stuff, but the guy that he follows is called Hamza. So he said, but Hamza says you really should have like 5 women on the go, not just one. And I was kind of like, right, okay. So how does that impact you then in terms of this thing? And he's like, I need to see how it goes and whatever. So we kind of left that conversation thinking, I wonder what direction that's going to go in. Is he going to stick to his own devices and say, actually, I really like this girl, I'm just going to stay with her? Or is he going to go, oh, well, the influencer says this? So I met him again, and he actually was, much to my surprise, was sort of saying, I'm still with her. Like, it's just me and her. Like, we're getting on really well. This is really good. And he then admitted to me that a lot of the time the thoughts aren't his own. And, he was really, I thought, wow, this guy's like very aware of this. This is great. But then I went back and a third time to meet with him, and this was a little bit later, and he was kind of like, nah, I'm done with that. I have so much value that I've worked for. It's like I don't want to just be with one woman because I built this value, and because I built that value, I deserve to have multiple women, and that's what his coach or his leader had told him. And interestingly, when I challenged him on that, he said that, women have an inherent value. So women, if they're born, they're told this, which is if a woman is born pretty or, good looking, they have an inherent value, whereas men do not have that. So he thought that he had to do a certain amount of work to ever have any kind of value as a man. But women automatically had that value, whatever that was, which meant he was entitled to become promiscuous, but a woman isn't. So because she did not earn that value. So when I challenged him on that and said, well, I, for example, I'm not promiscuous, and I would like to say I'm high value to your consideration of what high value is. I'm not promiscuous. What do you think about that? And he was kind of like, oh, well, that's your choice. But for me, I've worked really hard. I have built my value up. So I should be promiscuous, and that's how they feel about it. So they kind of feel like women have this sense of value inherently that they don't necessarily need to. They need to be with one man. They're not allowed to be promiscuous. They're not allowed to seek anything outside of one relationship, which obviously, I guess, speaks to the sort of domineering, submissive thing that they all talk about as well. So that was quite shocking to hear that.
Yeah, but always there's a classic double standard there. Yeah. They would implant that in people and also give it this scientific veneer of by drawing on this very very simplified version of the most clickbaity just so evolutionary psychology. So that would be part of it, and then that manifested in the men. They felt like they always needed to be performing. So they felt like they always needed to be performing this version of masculinity, this cartoonish version of masculinity. So they'd walk around as wearing a costume, basically. And that could also end in one instance of a character, one of the darker sections of my book, there's someone who that did end in violence because they would be putting on this performance, and then they would expect other people to kind of respect that performance and go along with it, and they'd expect women to be subservient. They'd expect other men to treat them as a high status alpha male and when that didn't happen, then they would often lash out because it messed with their sense of reality, because these characters online who they'd really invested heavily in, these cults online, as I would call them, it shook their reality, so then they'd lash out. And I think that sometimes I don't think that's new, but I think it's something you see kind of re-emerge with the manosphere, and it's kind of amplified by the way they're kind of siloed into these cult-like communities, and as James talked about, these communities where they do isolate you from other members of society that may be better role models.
It's interesting, thank you. You've talked a little bit about how that manifests in violence potentially towards women, but also how when you get drawn into the manosphere, men are spending more time with other men. Did you see an increase of violence between men in any of that?
I mean, there's examples of so there's an example of someone in my book called Lyndon McLeod, who was who committed a mass shooting in Denver, Colorado, at the end of 2021, and he'd been someone who was scheduled to speak at the 21 convention, which I went to, but he was scheduled to speak a couple of years before. He was someone who's appeared on lots of manosphere podcasts, who was very much within that circle. And he was someone, who the manosphere retrospectively disowned him and said, he was just someone who was mentally ill. And there's probably an element of truth to that. I don't think he was a particularly stable human being, but he also swam in these ideological currents which reaffirmed to him that, like these fascistic ideological currents, which reaffirmed to him that he was a dominant alpha male, and women and minorities had kind of usurped the natural order, and people like Hillary Clinton, Joe Biden, the Democrats, and modern society had overturned the natural order, and we needed to go back to this more traditionalist way of being. And that message resonated in the manosphere. It's why he was on all of these podcasts. And then he ended up going on this shooting spree and taking revenge on people who he felt hadn't given him the respect he deserved as a natural born alpha male. And that's an extreme example, but there are other examples of, I'd say again, more subtle and insidious examples where in a domestic setting it can end in violence, coercive behaviour, controlling behaviour, because they've imbibed these ideas about the natural order and men and women's place within that, and this kind of pseudo-scientific veneer of I need to be performing, women shouldn't be out in the workplace, women shouldn't have male friends, men trying to vet what women wear before they go out and things like this. That's one way it can. I've kind of lost track of the original question, but that's one way it can manifest in men's treatment of women.
It also seems to me that there's a bit of a kind of cycle here, and picking up on some of the things that you've already said, some of these myths that are coming out from the manosphere, for example, this kind of fear of false accusations of rape, is that potentially making young men so fearful to approach women that they are attracted to, that it becomes a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy. They then feel unsuccessful in dating and therefore go back to the manosphere for that help. So it sort of creates its own problem.
Interestingly, some of the guys that I spent time with said exactly that, which was they felt like the world that we live in now there's so much pressure on men when it comes to dating and women, where they're kind of worried about they think that women are dangerous. They think that women can get them in trouble. They think that they can accuse them of things, and for that reason, they use that as the reasoning. They tend to not date. They tend to stay away from women, which, as you say, is kind of counterproductive to the whole thing, because ultimately the whole thing is about women. It's all about raising your status as a man to become high value to get women. But somewhere along the line they're saying, women are the worst thing ever, they're dangerous, don't go near them. So they definitely, they seem to have that viewpoint. They mentioned that to me multiple times, that they're nearly fearful of women. And that is because of the content that they're consuming, because they're being told that this stuff by these creators, that women are this, women accuse people of rape, women are dangerous. There was one piece of content I seen where it was saying that women will get pregnant on purpose to trap men. and because they want you for your money. And and a lot of these men, don't actually have any, but they're doing it anyway. But they, so there's a lot of pretty extreme things being told to these men, and they take it verbatim, because you have to remember they're inside this community. Like, if you kind of differ your opinion or you have a different viewpoint, chances are that you're going to be chastised for that. Like, people are not going to like that in that community. Everybody wants to drive forward as a collective, as one. So if you see something that is actually pretty silly and just sounds ridiculous, to challenge that would be really, really bad, and I heard about examples of that where somebody within the group challenged something and then they were ousted from the group, or prior to that made to look foolish in front of everybody, and suddenly you've got, I think at the time he was 12, suddenly you've got hundreds of older lads then sending him abusive messages on these communities because the leader of that group decided that he challenged him, and that's not on. And so it's a very nuanced thing.
I've got one
very short one,
very,
because
very
we've
quick
got
question. Sorry.
less than half an hour to get through to the last two.
It seems that there's a lot of cognitive dissonance here with insecurity and alpha male and loving and hating women all at the same time, and these sort of holding these two things in mind is not only difficult, but as we've talked about, potentially violent. Is one of the solutions to this to teach boys better communication skills?
I mean, partly. I mean, it's obviously something that's hard to teach. I mean, the thing with my example was when I kind of went online 20 years ago and sought out kind of dating advice. Essentially, was what I was going to say typed into Google, but I think it was Ask Jeeves or whatever. when I asked Jeeves for some advice 20 years ago. I was living with my grandmother at the time in Somerset. I dropped out of education. I wasn't really, my social muscles it was a bit like during COVID, my social muscles had atrophied. I wasn't going out much. And I kind of just needed to put myself out there again, really, and just kind of build that social muscle again and just get used to interacting with people. And I think that's become harder in some ways now, because we do tend to spend more time indoors, whether it's post-COVID or before that it was happening, on phones, staring at screens. There are fewer kind of public spaces. We have less disposable income to go to some of the places to socialise that we may have done in the past. There's just less face-to-face contact where you can kind of pick up and learn those. I mean, I find it difficult to learn, to kind of learn those things naturally. It took me, I feel like I was a late developer in terms of learning how to kind of social etiquette, if that's the right term or whatever. And I think that can happen. That's true for a lot of people, especially neurodivergent people. And I think there's just less face-to-face interaction now. So I think creating those public spaces, youth clubs were mentioned earlier. I think that's something that could be done to help this along for sure. I don't know about. I think being respectful is important. So I think in terms of those kind of interactions with a member of the opposite or the same sex, someone you're interested in, I think. One of the things, you have these figures in the manosphere, male separatists, who will say that they're separating from women because they're afraid of false rape accusations, etc. But I think also it can be a bit of a red herring. That stuff is approaching someone to go and talk to them, or starting a conversation, or whatever, speed dating, meeting after you've met them on an app. It is hard. It does make you anxious. It's normal to be nervous about that. It is kind of hard to put yourself out there. But I think it's where a lot of men, I suppose, go wrong is they don't know how to put themselves out there in a way that if they're not interested in you, you back off respectfully. Like, say you go and talk to someone and you realise they're not interested. You then say, "Oh, nice to meet you," and you leave. It's simple things like that. It's like, this isn't going to happen. This isn't going to go anywhere. Respectfully, leave. And I think. Men and women could both do with men being taught, and maybe when they're younger, that a bit more, I suppose.
Thank you, Alex. You've talked about neurodivergence a lot. You were late diagnosed of ADHD. Did it help when you had your diagnosis with ADHD understand why perhaps people that are neurodivergent are more attracted to the manosphere in that respect, and why it is that you saw people that were neurodivergent and struggled with those kind of social cues that you just talked about there?
Yeah, I mean, there was definitely, I mean, from my own perspective, it helped just in a bunch of things just to retrospectively understand myself a bit better. I mean, also with like lifestyle management now, like structuring my life in a certain way to kind of work with the disorder rather than working against it. That was a huge thing for me personally. There were a lot of there were a disproportionate number of people who were on the autism spectrum who I met right through the manosphere, especially in terms of like getting in, like following pickup artists on these courses that I hung around. Some of the people taking men out on courses, I'd say kind of 1 in 4 roughly would be someone who either told us they were on the autism spectrum or it was just kind of pretty clear. They kind of gravitated towards that because they saw social interaction through a problem-solving context. They often did a job, like they were an engineer or something, and they did a job where they wouldn't be socializing with a lot of people, whether it was very much about problem-solving, and they transposed that onto their dating life, which often hadn't gone very well, and they thought if I just applied this kind of script or this, this is the beginning to end of this interaction, and if I just follow this, I'll be able to be happy and have a partner like everyone else. And there were people like that who just, it was this huge, going out to a bar or something and chatting to someone was this huge intimidating thing. And there are some better dating coaches around now, but there's also a lot of snake oil salespeople who they get drawn into because those people are very good marketers. The best people at marketing in those spaces generally tend to be the ones you wouldn't want to be in their hands, essentially.
Thank you. David, and then I'm coming to Nia.
Thank you very much. Thank you for everything so far, really interesting. We talked near at the start about the impact people with poor mental health or perhaps lonely, people suffering from loneliness, and they can be pulled in to the manosphere. If you want to elaborate on that a bit more, then you're welcome to, but I'm quite interested to know, once somebody's been pulled into the manosphere, what involvement does that have on the impact does that have on their mental health? Maybe James Blake first.
Sure. Well, my understanding from the time I spent with the guys, especially out in Portugal, because it was more of a group setting where they were sharing things with each other, was just that they all felt a shared sense of loneliness. And they had always kind of felt that, it's not just a random thing. They'd always had that. They didn't have peers in the real world. As an example, one of the guys had spoke to one of the other guys for 2 years and never met him in person. And he still considered him to be his best friend, and he'd never met in person. So actually experiencing them meeting in person for the first time was quite like a nice thing, because it was very emotional. But that sense of community for them is so important. And, these guys in particular, they had framed this as they were going to this property in Portugal. They called it Adonis House, which was the nickname they'd given it. And the plan was that they would all work, they would all try to make money together and all of that. But to be honest, as far as I could see, they actually just wanted to hang out. That they literally were going there to hang out and become part of a community and a group where they didn't feel lonely anymore. For example, one of the guys was saying to me, he has no friends in the real world, like none. He didn't like school, he left school, he got bullied in school, and his only friends were this group of people. So there's a lot of power in that, and there's a lot of hold in that. So whenever you get that, the taste of that, and potentially withdrawing from that, is a scary thought. And when he got back from Portugal, I actually asked him, so what's going through your head now? Because that is kind of a temporary fix to the problem. He was very self-aware enough to say, I am lonely. He was very self-aware enough to say that. And I sort of said, is this not a bit of a temporary thing? Because you're not going to fly to Portugal every day to see these lads. They all live around the world, What do you think about that? And he was kind of like, oh no, we've already booked the next trip. One of the guys is coming here actually next month, So that sense of community and belonging is really a massive thing to these guys. And I feel like it's actually probably the thing that is keeping them in that space. Because the guys that I met, realistically, I think from what they told me was the elements of like success and being successful and being this like version of a man that is pushed towards them, I don't actually know if that's exactly what they want. I think at the core of it, they just want friends and friendship, and they got that from what they were doing, and they weren't able to find that in the real world. They said they had no access to youth clubs. They weren't part of communities or football teams or anything like that. So they found a real belonging in those groups, and I think that they all were aware enough to say they were lonely, and this was something that was fixing that, plugging that gap.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with that. I think that's I couldn't really. There's nothing for me to add to that. Although I would say that with mental health, I mean, so you have that's the kind of paradox about these communities. In some ways, you have men who gravitate towards it and find this community of other men, this locker room experience. They bond over self-development, or bond over talking about women, and helping each other, or giving each other appraisals on honest appraisals on what they need to do to kind of be a more successful man or be more respected. But also, the more time they spend within the manosphere, the more of a negative influence it exerts on their mental health, because they're swimming in this kind of paranoid world where you have these kind of these guru figures always hovering above the manosphere, hovering within those circles, who are always trying to sell them the next product, the next course. They always want to persuade them that they're not enough as they are, that we live in this paranoid world where they're a few dates away from a false rape accusation, one marriage away from paternity fraud, raising someone else's kid unknowingly, and that they need to kind of constantly be on this treadmill of self-development because they're never going to be enough. They need to be attending these seminars, attending these workshops, buying these courses, buying these mentoring programs, and they see these guru figures who appear very successful to them. But then the great unspoken is that the way they made all their money from selling courses to these men, not from actually any kind of business acumen. So it can create, the longer you're in that world, the harder it is to come out in many ways, but also the more it can like damage your mental health, I think, because you get this very skewed, you've been fed this very skewed view of humanity and the world and men and women for a handful of people to profit from.
Mr. Bloodworth, in the past you've spoken about the positive impact that maybe 20% of what's in the manosphere can have on a man or a boy. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about that? And I guess also going on from that, how can we try and help young men and boys fill those spaces where they're getting the positives? How can they get those positives from elsewhere?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose like James touched on the positives in some way. Like there is this kind of, like if you look at any community like that, if it were all just negative for the people, like no one would be involved in it in the first place. So you have to look at, well, what is it about this that makes it attractive? And first of all, there'd be the camaraderie. You have people who tend to be, as James touched on really eloquently, you have people who are isolated, maybe don't have a friendship group, and they unite around this one topic that they all kind of are interested in. And then, I mean, I have still some friends, like a handful, maybe a couple, I think, I met back in like years and years ago when I was actually interested in the manosphere. They're not involved in that world anymore, but we first met through that. And I think, giving men like basic tips on like conversation starters, or advice like you need to dress better, you need to leave the house, you need to clean your teeth and use mouthwash before you go to the nightclub. There's nothing inherently toxic about that. The problem is all the baggage that tends to come with it. And there is this vacuum in terms of some of this stuff, some of these areas where, I don't think it's as bad nowadays in some ways, but I think when I was young, it didn't feel like I had anyone I could talk to about that stuff. And the patriarchy kind of makes it worse. Like toxic masculinity, if you like, makes it worse because as men, we're not supposed to admit we don't know what to do in the area of dating, or we don't know how to perform successfully in some area of our life. Yeah. Like this isn't women's fault. This is something that's kind of been like we've been indoctrinated with it in many ways that we're supposed to be, 100% put together, stoic, invulnerable, and when you're not like that, when you don't feel like that, and I don't think most men feel like that, certainly not as a teenager and a man in their early a boy really in their early 20s, you don't feel like that. And it always felt to me there was like, I didn't have a dad. My granddad died before I was born. Who do I talk to about this stuff? There probably were people, but I was so embarrassed. It was like I went looking online. And I think we're moving in a positive direction on that. It's easy to say, everything's getting worse. But I think, men are less reluctant to say get therapy now than they were when I was younger. Stoicism is less kind of in vogue, I think, certainly among like middle class men than it was in the past. But I think the danger with some of the mainstream of some of the manosphere figures or these manosphere adjacent figures, they're telling men that, they need to go back to this like stoic kind of worldview, and they need to be tough and they need to be strong. Otherwise, they're not a real man. I think that's where the danger lies at the moment. But yeah, I mean, if there was nothing positive from those communities, no one would be attracted to them. It's about kind of extracting that from them, stopping them being able to own that space, and I think that is improving, but slowly.
It's interesting because there's still, when you look at the facts, men's mental health is in a pretty poor place. 3 out of every 4 suicides are men. Men are, again, often through the whole masculinity type thing, are often unwilling to talk about their feelings, and there's still those barriers there. And I'm quite interested to know, how do you think we can improve the mental health of men and boys, and how we can also help men and boys who are perhaps feeling lonely? So first you, Mr. Blake.
Yeah, I mean, I think the community aspect is a big part of it, for sure. I think the fact that these young lads are finding these communities online, ran by individuals that just want to monetize, is a dangerous thing. I think that the communities should not be ran like that. And I also feel that those communities, albeit we touched on how good they are and how they can give that sense of friendship and things like that, but we're also forgetting that they isolate them from the rest of the world. So that sort of subculture isn't enough. It can't be enough, because even within that community, there's a whole world outside of that, and actually that's where you learn most of the things. That's where you develop, from people that are different than you, not people that just echo the exact same things back to you all the time. That's an extremely unhealthy place. So I think that community setups where you're meeting and you're learning about other people and things like that. I mean, I've been doing television now for a few years, and I've been to the Philippines, I've been to Thailand, I've been all over Southeast Asia, America, different things, met people from all different backgrounds, and that, for me, even at this age, has developed me so much. I've learned so much from that, and it's every time I make a new documentary, it completely changes how I see the world. And to think that, I'm very privileged to have that, but to think that not seeing other people's viewpoints for a long period of time is very damaging to your brain, to how you view the world around you. And I just think that, albeit the communities are great within what they're doing on the face of it, and there is one positive aspect to it, that needs to be expanded massively, and it needs to bring in people from all different backgrounds, all different cultures. And it's just sort of, I mean, I don't know how you do that. I guess it's not my job to know how to do that, but I think that is something that they lack massively, that we all lack massively, I think, as people. Aside from bars and nightclubs and things like that, James talked about neurodivergent people. A lot of neurodivergent people don't like nightclubs and bars. Other people don't like it for different reasons. Maybe it's religion or whatever it could be. So there needs to be things that are very community driven, that are inclusive of everybody, and allows that space for young men to open up. Because I definitely seen, especially in Portugal, in that group setting with the young guys, they all were happy to share feelings with each other. They were all opening up to each other. And that is something that you don't typically see men doing. But they felt safe. They felt safe in that little bubble of theirs. So if we can expand that and bring other people in, I think that is only a good thing.
I was going to say, like, having places that aren't just for-profit spaces, and making sure the material conditions catch up with the rhetoric around mental health. So we talk a lot about opening up. Men need to open up about their mental health. There'd be an item on the news about, say, Prince Harry or something talking about his mental health. This is all a progressive development. Yet, if you actually want to talk about your mental health, and I mean, 2022, my grandmother died. She brought me up. We were very close. And after I sought like grief counselling, it was very difficult to deal with. And then there's like a 6-month waiting time or something to speak to a counsellor. And by which time I've kind of figured it out in other ways. But it's like there's all this stuff about this message: open up. Men need to talk about their mental health. And then when you actually seek help, it can be very hard to actually. There's not the money there. There hasn't been the money there for 14 years. But then it's difficult.
Controversial. Wonder what happened in those 14 years. Thanks, Tim. Nia.
Thank you very much. It's been an absolutely fascinating session this afternoon, and I don't want to end up asking you to repeat yourselves too much, but I am definitely, because I am a former teacher, going to give you the most difficult questions. So you've talked about all the uncertainty that men feel and how, what is it, how am I going to make my way in the world, and the chip on the shoulder and the everybody against you. So really what we want to try and look at now is trying to say, well, why is that happening? What are the main drivers of that uncertainty about what masculinity really is? And how do you think we get a really healthy model of masculinity? And how do we communicate that with young men? In other words, how are we going to get out of this situation, really?
Well, I personally think that we, as a society and the media in general, are very good at promoting healthy examples of femininity and feminism. So there's a lot of empowerment around women entrepreneurs and different things like that. You see it a lot of magazines lead with that kind of thing. I guess men are kind of forgotten about, because I guess for so long men dominated those spaces, and now it's not like that. It's very, very open for everybody.
Can I stop you there? As a former teacher, there was always a thing that if you gave boys and girls an equal amount of attention, the boys thought they had less. It's almost an inbuilt perception. Even when you do have positive role models, and the positive ones can be very masculine, they don't have to be feminized or anything.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think the perception of the young guys that I spent time with is that positive role models are not spoken about enough. Whether that's true or not, I don't know, but that is definitely the perception. However, what I personally do feel is that the negative examples of masculinity are spoken about a lot. So like, for example, Andrew Tate gets a lot of platforming, and whether the conversation is around what he's doing wrong or what he's doing right, probably not a lot, but there is a platform there, and ultimately that gets him into people's phones, it gets him on their screens and things like that. And I, from speaking to the guys that I've spoke to, they all shared the same opinion that, for example, I asked them to give me a positive masculine role model, and none of them could. Like, they actually couldn't. But when I said a negative masculine role model, they were able to fire off things like Donald Trump, Andrew Tate. They were able to say all of these people that are, I guess, you see in the media a lot. But they were not able to tell me anyone positive. Whether that's selective on their part or not, I'm not sure. But maybe there's something in that.
I think breaking down stereotypes can help with this stuff. So if we talk about teaching, encouraging more men to become teachers, encouraging more men to go into caring professions. I had a very good teacher in college who encouraged me to go to university, who was inspired me with the kind of bug of learning. It was kind of the best teacher I had, and it really made me believe in myself and made me think that I could go on to university, I could kind of progress forward. And it's just kind of seeing yourself in them in some ways. It's not like I didn't have, my grandmother was the most influential person in my life growing up. It's not like it's a zero-sum competition between men and women. It's just sometimes you need someone to identify with who you can really see yourself in. And I think we recognise that in terms of, say, women's sport. I mean, women's football's exploded, and this is fantastic. But it's also, I think, true of men. This is why the role model question is so important. And I think men are going through this kind of recalibration of where they draw status from in some ways. So you could say that men have lost status relative to women in some fields, and that's a good thing, because men had far more status than women in the employment in the world of employment in the past, for example, in the home. And so now there is this recalibration, and I think men are dealing with that, and there is this conversation that in some ways is only just beginning in some quarters about how you deal with that. How do you draw status? You have some parts of the world where there, in places like Russia, where there is a reversion to some, the government doesn't give anyone, apart from poverty and war, but in your home you can still be a feudal lord. You can still feel like a feudal lord. And that was true to some extent of this country in the past. And we're still coming out of that. And there are some men, it's like, where do I draw status from now? They can't find it in the workplace. They can no longer find it in the home or the family. And, where do they, what is our identity now? I think there's a lot of confusion around that. We're going in the right direction. It's like there's been huge progress made. It's not to kind of diminish that. It's not a zero-sum competition between men and women. It's not to say that men are facing more problems than women. I think men and women face different challenges. And I think women face far more problems than men still in many walks of life. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't kind of recognise that there is this kind of readjustment many men are having to go through in terms of where they draw their self-esteem, where they draw their identity from. And there are so many confusing narratives. And the manosphere is one place that really capitalises on that confusion and monetises it.
So in terms, therefore, of trying to stop the spread of the manosphere, how do we go about doing that? And is there any way that somebody who's very, very drawn into it can actually be helped to come out of it, perhaps in the way that you've seen?
I think it's a difficult one to answer because it's so nuanced. There's so many, the manosphere in itself has so many components in it. There's so many different variations and ideologies within it. I think, for me, with my own personal experience of the manosphere and the space that I seen and that I fell into for a little period of time, I guess what took me out of that was essentially just maturity and realising that the stuff that I was watching actually wasn't serving me and didn't have a positive purpose. But I'm also aware that not everybody will come to that point, and some people will not have that awareness around that. So I think talking helps a lot, so for example, family members, talking to family members, or if, for example, somebody in your family or somebody is absorbing all of this stuff, having a conversation with them. And like we've spoke a lot today about loneliness, and there could be something at the core of their need for that content which could be solved in another way, whether that's through talking, counselling, therapy, or just simply having a mate to pick up the phone and say, let's go get a pint, because actually a lot of this just comes down to that loneliness problem.
Yeah, definitely. And creating that space within friendship groups and families where someone can be vulnerable and it doesn't feel like they're being judged for it, where creating that safe space for that to kind of open up about these things, to open up about insecurities, challenges, and about male role models, male figures stepping up to be that kind of person who can say, you're barking up, they may ventriloquize something, they may repeat something they've heard online, and it's like you're barking up the wrong tree. You don't need to. These people haven't got your best interests at heart. They're trying to sell you something. I mean, having some kind of figure you respect, and it doesn't have to be a man, but having someone you respect, or I say man because sometimes someone you can identify with, who can then tap you on the shoulder and say, look, you don't need to, these people haven't got your interests at heart. I mean, creating that space, I think is so important.
Thank you, Nia. Thank you so much to you both. It has been a really thought-provoking and enlightening session. I'm sure that's reflective of the whole committee's feelings. Yep. My God, it sounds so exhausting, the loneliness and the performance element of it of the manosphere just sounds exhausting to me. And also, ironically, something that I think a lot of women will identify with, that loneliness and that monetization of their sadness is really something, and their vulnerability is something that I think, ironically, a lot of women will identify with. We talked about role models. I think we're looking at 2 role models right here. Kim, and I want to quote, as she whispered to say goodbye, she said, "I want you to tell them that I think they're both fucking brilliant." So I've done it. I promised her I would. I just want to say a massive thank you to you both, and that brings this session to a close. Order.
Thank you.
Thank you.